He had to be the most valuable player during that World Series. But if he was trying to throw a ball game, he did a poor job.
Everything that he did and these other guys did, I think they should put that in the past and they should concentrate on what they did on the baseball field. And obviously, Joe and Pete were two of the greatest that ever played the game. They ought to look at those stats and they ought to consider that whenever they vote for the Hall of Fame.
Joe told Comiskey that he didn't want to play. He'd like for him to sit out the series because of what's happening among the teammates. And Comiskey refused to bench him and made him play in all 8 games full time.
You're banned. That is what baseball said to one of its greatest ever players. And for over 100 years, Major League Baseball made sure those words followed Shoeless Joe Jackson straight to his grave, making him the permanent face of everything wrong with the sport, while quietly hiding everything wrong with itself. I am Mason, and this is Baseball Icons. On May 13th, 2025, something shifted. Commissioner Rob Manfred announced that permanent ineligibility ends at death. And just like that, Joe Jackson was officially removed from the banned list. The door to Cooperstown cracked open for the first time in over a century. And if you believe Joe Jackson deserves that Hall of Fame plaque, hit the hype button and give this video some hype while we dig into exactly why baseball kept this man buried for so long. But here is the thing that should bother you about that 2025 ruling. Baseball did not say sorry. They did not say they were wrong. They used a technical rule change to quietly move past one of the most unjust decisions in the history of American sport, hoping nobody would look too closely at what they were actually admitting. Was this really about what happened in 1919? Or was Joe Jackson simply the perfect scapegoat for a league that had too much to lose by telling the truth? Let us start at the very beginning, because to understand why the injustice of what happened to Joe Jackson cuts so deep, you first have to understand who he was before any of it. You have to understand what baseball actually lost when it decided to bury him. Joe Jackson grew up in the cotton mill towns of Greenville, South Carolina, born into deep poverty at a time when children from families like his went to work before they ever went to school. He worked in the cotton mills from a very young age. He never learned to read. He never learned to write. Throughout his entire life, when legal documents needed his name on them, he pressed an X onto the page and trusted the people around him to explain what he was agreeing to. That striking combination of talent and vulnerability, that gap between what he could do on a baseball field and what he could not do in a courtroom or a lawyer's office, is at the center of everything that eventually happened to him. He began his baseball journey playing for the local mill-sponsored teams around Greenville. These were rough fields, informal games, working-class players competing for the love of the sport. The mill towns of South Carolina were not the kind of place that produced polished, professionally coached athletes. There were no scouts watching those games. There were no academies or training facilities. There were just men and boys who loved the game, playing because baseball was one of the few things in those mill towns that could lift the weight of the working day off a person's shoulders, even for just a few hours. It was on one of those fields, on a day when a brand new pair of cleats had torn his feet apart and left him with painful blisters, that he pulled off his shoes mid-game and kept right on playing. A fan in the crowd called out a nickname at him: Shoeless Joe. A mame born from a sore-footed decision on a dusty South Carolina field became one of the most recognizable names in the history of American sport. When Jackson arrived in the major leagues, the baseball world understood almost immediately that it was seeing something special. In his very first full season, he put up a batting average that has never been matched by any other rookie in the history of the sport. Not before him, and not since. He swung a custom-made black ash bat that he had named Black Betsy, and with it, he combined extraordinary raw power with a natural contact ability that made him nearly impossible to pitch to effectively. He did not just hit the ball, he drove it. He punished mistakes. He turned ordinary pitches into extra base hits with a swing that coaches and scouts described as the most pure, natural motion they had ever seen. Even Ty Cobb took notice. Cobb was the fiercest competitor of the dead ball era. He was not a man who gave compliments. He spent his entire career looking for edges, studying opponents, and refusing to concede respect to anyone. But when it came to Joe Jackson, even Cobb could not stay quiet. He openly told people that Jackson was the greatest natural hitter he had ever witnessed in his life. That is not a casual thing. Coming from Ty Cobb, that is about the highest praise a hitter could ever receive. By the time Jackson was traded to the Chicago White Sox, he had built a career batting record that placed him just behind Cobb and Rogers Hornsby in overall lifetime hitting efficiency. Those were the two best hitters in baseball. Joe Jackson was right behind them. His throwing arm from the outfield was exceptional. His range in left field was smooth and reliable. His bat was the most dangerous weapon on a Chicago White Sox roster that was widely recognized as the most talented collection of players in the entire dead ball era. The best team in baseball. The best hitter on that team. Everything pointed toward a career that would have ended in Cooperstown without any debate at all. But the White Sox were more than just a talented team. They were also a deeply unhappy one. And the reason for that unhappiness had one name: Charles Comiskey. In that era, baseball players had no freedom. The reserve clause bound every player to his team for as long as the owner wanted to keep him. There was no free agency. There was no players' union. There was no collective bargaining. If you wanted to play professional baseball, you played for whoever held your contract, for whatever salary they decided to pay you, under whatever conditions they chose to impose. Refusing was not a real option. Walking away meant giving up the game entirely. Comiskey took every advantage of that system thoroughly. He owned the most talented roster in the major leagues and paid them some of the lowest salaries in the entire sport. He was legendary throughout the game for his stinginess, and not in an admirable or clever way, in a cruel, petty way that made his players feel disrespected every single day. He charged his own players to have their uniforms laundered. Think about that for a moment. The Chicago White Sox were one of the most profitable franchises in baseball, playing in front of packed stadiums, winning pennants, generating enormous revenue for their owner. And Comiskey made those same players pay out of their own pockets to wash the dirt off their uniforms. His players wore dirty uniforms so often and resented it so deeply that people around the league started calling them the Black Sox, long before any scandal existed. The name came from unwashed clothes, not corruption. He promised his pitcher, Eddie Cicotte, a $10,000 bonus if Cicotte could reach 30 wins in a season. Cicotte was having a remarkable year and was getting close. When he was within striking distance of that number, Comiskey simply benched him. He removed Cicotte from the rotation on purpose, preventing him from making enough starts to reach the target, and kept the bonus money that he had promised. He did not even pretend to have a good reason. He just took the money back because he had the power to do it, and nobody could stop him. The players had tried to push back through normal channels. They had complained. They had negotiated as best they could without any real leverage. Some of them had gone directly to Comiskey and asked for raises that reflected the revenue they were generating for him. Comiskey's response was consistent. He dismissed them. He reminded them that they could either play for what he chose to pay, or they could find another way to make a living. And in the era of the reserve clause, those were genuinely the only two options available to them. The system was constructed to give owners total power and players total vulnerability. Comiskey did not create that system. He just used it more aggressively and with less conscience than almost anyone else in the sport. Year after year, these players watched their owner profit enormously from their talent while treating them like they had no value beyond what they produced on the field. They had no legal recourse. They had no union backing them up. They had no leverage whatsoever. They were, as the research puts it plainly, effectively the property of their owners. Under those conditions, when professional gamblers came looking for players willing to participate in fixing the 1919 World Series, the White Sox were the most vulnerable team in baseball. Desperate men, locked into an oppressive system with no escape, were offered financial security that their own employer had deliberately withheld from them. That does not make the decision to participate in the fix an honorable one. It was a serious mistake that hurt the sport and betrayed the fans. But calling it simple greed misreads the situation entirely. This was not greed. This was a labor system so broken, so exploitative, that it manufactured the conditions for a catastrophe. Joe Jackson sat inside that pressure cooker. He was the most exploited player on an exploited team. He was illiterate and unsophisticated. He was being underpaid by an owner who viewed him as property. And he was about to be pulled by his teammates into something he did not fully understand, then punished for it, far more harshly than anyone else involved. Now here is the moment in the story where you need to stop and look at the actual numbers from the 1919 World Series, because they are the most powerful argument in Joe Jackson's defense, and they do not get nearly enough attention. 8 Chicago White Sox players were accused of accepting money from a gambling syndicate to deliberately lose the World Series to the Cincinnati Reds. Those 8 players would become known as the Black Sox. Joe Jackson was one of them. That is the accusation. Now look at what he actually did on the field during those 8 games. He led both teams in batting average with a 375. Not just his team, both teams combined. Nobody on either roster hit better than Joe Jackson in that series. He collected 12 hits, which set a World Series record that would stand for nearly 50 years. He hit the only home run of the entire series. Neither team combined for another one across 8 full games. Joe Jackson hit the only one. He drove in 6 runs, more than any other White Sox player, accounting for a substantial portion of his team's entire offensive output. He scored 5 runs himself. Between his runs batted in and his runs scored, he was directly involved in 11 of his team's 20 total runs throughout the whole series. He handled 17 fielding chances across 8 games and committed 0 errors. Not one. And from left field, he threw out 5 Cincinnati base runners, more than any outfielder from either team managed. Read those numbers again and ask yourself one honest question. What does a player trying to lose a World Series look like? Because it does not look like that. A player trying to lose does not bat 375. A player trying to throw a series does not throw out 5 runners from the outfield. A player helping the other team win does not hit the only home run in the whole championship. Those are the statistics of someone fighting with everything they have. Let us put those numbers in even more concrete terms, because the raw stats alone do not fully communicate what they mean in context. The Chicago White Sox scored 20 total runs in the entire 8-game series. Joe Jackson was directly responsible for 11 of those 20 runs, either by driving teammates in or by scoring himself. That means more than half of every run his team scored traced back to him personally. On a team accused of trying to lose, more than half the offense came from the player accused of being part of that effort. The math simply does not work as an argument for guilt. His 12 hits set a World Series record. That record held for nearly 50 years. Across decades of fall classics, across generations of great players competing on baseball's biggest stage, nobody had managed to match what Jackson did in a series his name would later be attached to as a symbol of betrayal. The record he set while supposedly throwing the championship outlasted the careers of players who came after him with nothing but legitimate effort and clean reputations. That is how good he actually was in those 8 games. Critics have tried to identify specific plays where Jackson supposedly looked suspicious. In Game 1, a ball he fielded in left center ended up as a triple. In Game 2, there were claims he threw to the infield late. Those are the main pieces of evidence offered against him. But those moments need context that the critics consistently ignore. Behind Jackson in that series, pitcher Eddie Seacott was deliberately throwing soft pitches to Cincinnati batters, ignoring the calls from his own catcher, Ray Schalk, giving the Reds exactly what they needed to hit the ball hard. When your pitcher is sabotaging the game from the mound, unusual defensive plays happen. Jackson was an outfielder trying to compensate for a pitching staff that was actively working against its own team. Jackson himself addressed this under oath. He stated clearly and directly that he batted to win, ran the bases to win, fielded the balls in the outfield to win, and tried to win at all times. That was his sworn testimony. And the numbers from those 8 games confirm exactly what he claimed. There is something important about the combination of that sworn statement and those statistics. A man lying under oath about playing to win would still be expected to have a performance that showed at least some evidence of intentional failure. Bad fielding decisions, weak at-bats in key moments, inexplicable base running choices, something. Critics have pointed to 2 specific plays across 8 full games as potential evidence of dishonesty. And both of those plays have reasonable alternative explanations rooted in the chaos created by pitchers who were genuinely sabotaging the games. The absence of actual evidence of dishonest play, combined with the presence of record-setting honest play, produces only one logical conclusion. Joe Jackson was telling the truth when he said he tried to win at all times. So then how did any of this lead to a lifetime ban? In September 1920, the fix became public knowledge. A Cook County grand jury was convened to investigate. On September 28th, Joe Jackson was called to testify. According to the transcripts from that testimony, Jackson appeared to admit that he had accepted money from his teammate Lefty Williams and that he had knowledge of the conspiracy. For over 100 years, Major League Baseball has pointed to those transcripts as the cornerstone of its case against Jackson. What the league has never been eager to discuss is the context surrounding that testimony. On the morning of his grand jury appearance, Joe Jackson did not go to see his own lawyer. He went directly to the offices of Alfred Austrian. Austrian was the team counsel for Charles Comiskey, the owner of the White Sox. His job was to protect Comiskey from financial liability. His job was to preserve the team's insurance policies following the scandal. His job was, first and last, to serve the interests of the same man who had spent years underpaying and exploiting Joe Jackson. Austrian advised the illiterate outfielder to confess. Jackson had no independent legal representation in that room. He had no attorney whose loyalty was to him personally. He had no one explaining the legal implications of what he was being asked to say or sign or agree to. He had a man who worked for his enemy, guiding him through a legal process he could not read or fully understand, telling him what to do. During the grand jury session itself, the testimony Jackson gave was full of contradictions. He acknowledged receiving money from Williams, but repeatedly, throughout that same testimony, he insisted that he had done nothing dishonest on the field to earn it. He kept pointing to his own performance as the proof that he had competed honestly. Those contradictions have always been there in the record, for anyone willing to read them. They were not the words of a guilty man trying to construct a careful cover story. They were the words of a confused, illiterate person who had received money from teammates, had not grasped the full nature of the arrangement those teammates had made with gamblers, and had gone out and played his very best baseball while the conspiracy happened around him. When Jackson eventually obtained independent legal representation, his lawyers acted quickly. They filed formal affidavits directly repudiating the grand jury transcripts. They stated explicitly that their client had been misled, that he had not understood the legal waivers he was being pressured to sign or agree to, and that the testimony did not accurately represent his knowing participation in the fix. In a 1924 civil trial where Jackson was attempting to recover back pay owed to him by the White Sox, his attorneys flatly denied that he had made the incriminating statements in the first place. A hostile judge responded by citing Jackson for contempt of court. That was the final insult for an illiterate man who had spent years trying to navigate a legal and institutional system that was never designed to protect someone like him. There is also a popular myth surrounding this entire case that has done enormous damage to Jackson's reputation over the decades. The book 8 Men Out, published by Elliot Asanoff in 1963, and the film adaptation that followed it, told a story in which the players had signed written confessions that were then stolen by forces connected to gambler Arnold Rothstein. According to this version, those missing confessions were what caused the criminal prosecution to collapse. It is a dramatic story. It captured the public imagination. It became the dominant cultural narrative about the Black Sox scandal for a generation. It is also not what happened. Modern legal historians have established clearly that the players never signed written confessions of any kind. They gave oral testimony to the grand jury. Those statements were reconstructed by prosecutors from stenographic shorthand notes and read aloud during the criminal trial. The jury heard all of it. Every word that had been said in front of the grand jury was presented in that courtroom. Nothing was missing, nothing was stolen, and the jury acquitted them anyway. The 8 Men Out narrative served to cement Joe Jackson's guilt in the cultural subconscious in a way that had nothing to do with actual legal evidence. The romanticized story of vanishing confessions made him sound definitively guilty to millions of readers and viewers who had no reason to question it. The legal reality of his acquittal got buried under decades of dramatic storytelling. The criminal trial in the summer of 1921 was thorough and serious. It lasted 6 weeks. Both sides presented their full cases. The defense pointed to the lack of physical evidence, the manipulative role of the gamblers who had approached the players, and the oppressive conditions created by Comiskey's management. When it was over, a unanimous 12-member jury found all 8 players not guilty of all charges. Every count, not guilty. The jury heard everything and still came back with a complete acquittal. That verdict should have been the end of it. It was not. The business interests of Major League Baseball had already determined that a clean acquittal was a threat to the sport's reputation. Allowing the Black Sox to walk free would invite questions about how the fix had been possible in the first place. It would invite scrutiny of Comiskey's exploitation. It would expose the deep structural rot that had made players vulnerable enough to listen to gamblers offering the money their owner refused to pay. Baseball could not afford that conversation. So the team owners gave absolute authority to Kennesaw Mountain Landis. Landis was a former federal judge known for authoritarian, uncompromising decisions. The moment he was handed commissioner power, he looked at the jury's unanimous verdict and simply ignored it. He imposed permanent lifetime bans on all 8 players, including Joe Jackson, overriding the decision of a court of law with a personal decree. Landis was sending a message with that ruling, and the message was not really about the 1919 World Series. The message was about power. He was establishing that the commissioner's office sat above the American justice system. He was demonstrating that no court verdict could override what baseball decided. He was cementing the absolute authority of a position that had only just been created. And to make that demonstration as clear and lasting as possible, he needed permanent, visible symbols of that authority. He needed men who would spend their entire lives as banished outcasts, walking proof that crossing baseball had consequences no court could undo. Joe Jackson became one of those symbols. He was not banned because the evidence was overwhelming. He was banned because his banishment was useful. It served the institutional purpose of demonstrating that the commissioner's word was final, regardless of what any jury decided. Think about what that actually means. The American judicial system had processed this case. A grand jury had indicted the players. A criminal trial had been held with full testimony from all sides. A jury of 12 people had deliberated and returned a unanimous verdict of not guilty. Every legal mechanism that a society builds to determine guilt or innocence had been used, and it had produced a clear outcome. Landis simply announced that the outcome did not apply to his institution, that the rules that governed everyone else in America did not govern baseball, that within the world of the sport, his word was the only word that counted. That precedent, once established, became the foundation that every subsequent commissioner built upon. It was never seriously challenged. It was never seriously examined. It just sat there, generation after generation, keeping Joe Jackson banned and keeping the question of its legitimacy safely buried. He beat the criminal case in open court. Baseball did not care. For the next 100 years, that wall stayed up. Every generation produced new advocates for Jackson. Fans circulated petitions. Politicians from South Carolina submitted congressional resolutions. Former players who had known him or studied his career made emotional public appeals. Hall of Fame members wrote letters and gave interviews, arguing that keeping him out was an injustice the sport needed to correct. Commissioner after commissioner reviewed the arguments and said no. The reason was never really about guilt or innocence by that point. It was about what reinstatement would have required. To give Jackson his place back would have required the league to admit that its founding commissioner, the legendary Landis, had overridden a jury verdict and imposed a lifetime ban on a player whose on-field performance directly contradicted the accusation against him. It would have required admitting that the ban was never about justice. It was about power and optics. It would have required baseball to tell the truth about a lie it had been maintaining for over a century. That was a cost no commissioner was willing to pay. So the institutional hypocrisy continued to build. And by the time the 21st century arrived, that hypocrisy had become impossible to ignore. In 2017, the Houston Astros ran a sophisticated, team-wide operation to steal electronic pitch signs during the World Series. This was not a rumor or an allegation. It was investigated, confirmed, and documented. Players used a trash can banging system to signal batters about incoming pitches in real time. The scheme was coordinated at the organizational level. It directly influenced games in the sport's most important annual event. By any honest definition, it was a deliberate assault on the integrity of the World Series. Commissioner Manfred investigated and announced the punishment. Every single player who had participated in the scheme received complete immunity. No suspensions, no personal fines, no forfeitures, nothing. The organization was fined and lost some draft picks. The players kept their championship rings. Fans and media across the country described the response as a slap on the wrist. And that was being generous. Now place that alongside Joe Jackson. He batted .375 in the series he was accused of throwing. He committed 0 errors. A unanimous jury found him not guilty, and baseball banned him for life and kept him banned for over a century after his death. The Astros players cheated in a World Series with sophisticated technology and received no punishment at all. Jackson played his very best baseball in a World Series while allegedly part of a fix, was acquitted in court, and lost everything. The double standard does not require any complicated analysis. Modern baseball protected its current players and its current revenue. Historical baseball punished a long-dead man who was no longer around to defend himself or to generate any active value for the sport. That is the real moral architecture of Major League Baseball's integrity enforcement, laid out clearly for anyone willing to examine it honestly. Jackson's continued exile was never about protecting the game. It was about protecting a brand and protecting a narrative. And protecting the legacy of a founding commissioner whose most consequential decision was an act of institutional tyranny dressed up as moral leadership. That is the context in which the May 13th, 2025 ruling needs to be understood. When Manfred announced that permanent ineligibility ends automatically at death, he framed it as a logical, reasonable policy position. He wrote that once a person has passed away, the purposes of the rule have been served. He noted that someone no longer living cannot pose a threat to the integrity of the game. He argued that a penalty lasting an entire lifetime with no possibility of reprieve is already the maximum possible deterrent. Under that new policy, Jackson, along with Pete Rose and 15 other deceased individuals, was officially removed from the permanently ineligible list. The ban that had stood for over 100 years was lifted. But notice what Manfred did not say. He did not say that Landis had been wrong. He did not say that the ban had been unjust. He did not say that the jury verdict should have been respected. He did not say that the evidence against Jackson had always been weak. He did not acknowledge the manipulation of an illiterate man by a lawyer who worked for his enemy. He found a technical expiration for the sentence without ever examining whether the sentence had been deserved. The league did not offer Joe Jackson forgiveness. They waited until every person with any personal connection to the original decision had been dead for decades. And then they quietly let the punishment expire through a bureaucratic mechanism that required no admission of wrongdoing from anyone. The absolute authority of Landis remained untouched. The century of exile remained exactly what it had always been. Baseball just chose to stop enforcing it posthumously. That is a masterclass in institutional self-preservation. Do the minimum required to clear the pathway. Avoid every statement that might imply accountability for the past. Move forward without looking back. What the ruling does accomplish in a real and meaningful way is restore Jackson's eligibility for the Hall of Fame. The exclusion rule that the Hall adopted in 1991 applied specifically to individuals currently on Major League Baseball's permanently ineligible list. With Jackson removed from that list, the barrier no longer applies to him. His career is now eligible to be evaluated. His statistics are back on the table. His case can be heard. That hearing is scheduled for December 2027, when the Classic Baseball Era Committee convenes to evaluate candidates whose primary contributions to the game came before 1980. The committee has 16 members. To reach Cooperstown, a candidate needs at least 12 of those 16 votes. It is a demanding standard, and the debate over Jackson will be unlike any Hall of Fame discussion the committee has faced before. Supporters of Jackson will lead with the numbers. A lifetime batting average of 356, the third highest mark in Major League history. A rookie batting average of 408, still the all-time record for a first-year player. And the 1919 World Series performance, 375, 12 hits, the only home run, 6 runs batted in, 0 errors, 5 outfield assists. They will argue that these credentials belong in Cooperstown on pure merit alone, that the Hall of Fame exists to honor the greatest players the sport has ever produced, and that no honest accounting of baseball history can be complete without Joe Jackson. They will also argue that keeping him out any longer is nothing more than a continuation of the same institutional lie that drove the ban in the first place. The jury acquitted him. His performance contradicts the accusation. The process that produced his confession was corrupt. The ban was about power, not evidence. Every year he stays outside Cooperstown is another year baseball chooses institutional pride over historical honesty. The supporters will also make a point about what the Hall of Fame is supposed to represent. Cooperstown was built as a place to honor the men who shaped this sport. It was built to preserve their stories and pass them down. If the Hall claims to honor baseball history honestly, then it cannot indefinitely exclude one of the most statistically accomplished hitters the game has ever produced, based on a ban that a jury contradicted and a process that legal historians have documented as compromised. Keeping Jackson out does not protect the Hall of Fame. It undermines it. It makes Cooperstown complicit in the same institutional deception that baseball has maintained since 1921. Opponents will turn to the character clause. The Hall of Fame's requirements include a standard of integrity and character. And opponents will argue that even if Jackson did not actively throw games, he accepted money from gamblers who were paying to fix the series. He knew something was wrong, and he did not report it to team management. He took the $5,000 and stayed quiet. That choice, regardless of what he did on the field, represents a violation of the trust that the sport places in its players. and the character clause exists precisely for situations like this one. That argument deserves a genuine hearing, but it also demands genuine context. It demands a reckoning with the illiteracy, the manipulation, the lawyer who worked for his enemy, the owner who had exploited him for years. It demands an honest acknowledgement that the same league now citing character concerns had its own founding commissioner override a court of law. And it demands a direct comparison with Astros players who kept their rings after cheating in a World Series with none of the extenuating circumstances Jackson had. The 16 committee members who walk into that room in December 2027 will carry all of this with them. They will vote, and history will record what they decide. Baseball has always described itself as a sport built on memory and tradition, a game that honors its past more deeply than any other. If that is genuinely true, then the story of Joe Jackson is the most important test of that claim the sport has ever faced. A boy from the South Carolina mill towns who never learned to read, who gave himself a name by playing through blisters on a rough field with his shoes off, who swung a bat called Black Betsy with the most natural, pure motion the sport had ever seen, who was exploited by his owner, manipulated by teammates he trusted, guided toward a confession by a lawyer who worked for his enemy, and acquitted by a jury of 12 citizens who heard the full evidence, who then spent every remaining day of his life as a banned outcast because a commissioner needed a symbol of absolute authority more than he needed to tell the truth. The road to Cooperstown is open. The technical barrier is gone. What remains is the question of whether 16 people, representing baseball's own conscience, have the honesty and the courage to look at 100 years of this story. Look at the numbers from that 1919 series. Look at the courtroom verdict. Look at the manipulation and the exploitation and the institutional cowardice, and vote to bring him home. Baseball has always asked its fans to believe in the purity of its history. It asks them to care about records that are generations old, to revere players who played in a different century, to treat the statistics of the dead with the same seriousness as those of the living. That ask only holds up if the institution is willing to protect the honesty of that history in return. You cannot ask fans to believe in the sanctity of the record books and then maintain a century-old injustice for the sake of institutional convenience. The relationship between the sport and its history is built on a promise. The promise is that the numbers matter, that the truth matters, and that what a man did on the field eventually gets its proper recognition. Joe Jackson held up his end of that promise every time he stepped onto a diamond. He played with his whole entire self. He batted .356 over a career that baseball now pretends did not fully count. He set records that stood for decades. He earned the admiration of the greatest players of his generation. The sport owes him the same honesty in return. The December 2027 vote is not just about whether one more name gets added to a wall in a museum in Cooperstown, New York. It is about what kind of institution baseball chooses to be when the evidence is clear, when the injustice is documented, and when the only obstacle left is the willingness to acknowledge it. Other sports have faced moments like this. Some found the courage to do the right thing. Some did not. Baseball has had over a century to build up to this moment, and now it is almost here. The committee will vote. The sport will move on. But the record will show, forever, whether baseball chose honesty or chose to keep hiding behind the ghost of Kennesaw Mountain Landis. Joe Jackson cannot speak for himself. He never could in any room that mattered. But the numbers he left behind speak loudly enough for anyone willing to listen. Baseball has had a century to do the right thing. In December 2027, it gets another chance. The only question is whether this time it will find the courage to take it. If this story hit differently for you, leave a comment below. We want to know whether you think Shoeless Joe Jackson belongs in the Hall of Fame. Subscribe to Baseball Icons because the vote is coming and we will be covering every moment of it.